Let me tell you, I should have been advancing this. I would like to revisit this. So let me just review very quickly. Jesus is arrested. Outside of Gethsemane, his disciples desert him. He is taken up to the priestly villa. You have him, first of all, before Annas and then before the whole Sanhedrin. But they're doing it in the middle of the night, so they wait until the sun just barely begins to rise. They bring him back in. He once again confesses openly that he is the Christ once they get the entire testimony straight, and then he is taken to Pilate. Now, let me just say this to you, because it's a favorite point of mine. I've already walked you through the events of the Roman trial, the trial before Pontius Pilate. But you know, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 13, Paul says this to Timothy, and this really got a hold of me some years ago. He says, I adjure thee by the living God and by the good confession that Jesus witnessed before Pontius Pilate. And as I read that, I thought, you know, evidently, the way Jesus handled himself before Pontius Pilate was really important to the early Christians. And they went to school. They studied the way Jesus handled himself so that Paul could almost offhandedly say, he doesn't fill it out, he doesn't flesh it out. He just says, I adjure thee by the good confession that Jesus witnessed before Pontius Pilate. And so I spent some time. I spent some weeks trying to work through this and figure out who Pilate was and so on. But it's interesting that, as I said to you a moment ago, that throughout the trial before Pontius Pilate, and then before Herod, and then Herod Antipas, and then before Pontius Pilate again, Jesus never speaks, except when he's alone with Pilate in those two private interviews. And therefore, we have to assume that what Paul is referring to when he talks about the good confession is Jesus in those private interviews. And I want to take you to him there in John 18 and 19. It's John who gives us this record. And here, they led, the first one is right here, John 18 and verse 33. It says, then Pilate, now let me remind you, just real quickly. The Jewish leaders, Pilate had said to the Jewish leaders, what's the charge? They said, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him. We're not going to do it that way. And you go try him. They say, we can't do it. And so Pilate, because he's frustrated, he wants to get to the bottom of this, he enters the praetorium again. Now again, the praetorium is Herod's palace. And that gate that I showed you, I think he took him inside. He came down the steps off of his bema seat, took Jesus alone into the praetorium. Again, Jesus has already been somewhat misused, but he's not battered and bruised as he will be, but he is manacled and he's taken in. Now, I want you to follow this, all right? This is stunning to me because Pilate said, here it is right here, Pilate brought him in, he called Jesus and he said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Now, folks, that is a cripplingly ambiguous question. Think about the scene. Jesus is on trial for his life as a seditionist. Is he a seditionist? Absolutely not. Is he the king of the Jews? Absolutely. And so Jesus, and I think this is a good illustration of Jesus, if the Spirit of God had chosen to minister to Jesus an omniscient understanding of what Pilate meant, he wouldn't have to ask the question. But the Spirit of God does not so do, and so Jesus, because he's jealous for the truth, has to work at figure. So he says, Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? He might be asking, are you the seditionist that they claim you are? He might be asking, are you the long-awaited Messiah of Israel? The answer to the first is a negative, a no, and Jesus cannot allow any confusion. So he says in verse 34, are you speaking for yourself of this, about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? All he's saying is, Pilate, are you asking me out of your heart if I am king of the Jews? Or are you asking me if I'm guilty of what others have said? That's clearly what Pilate hears, because he says, his reply is, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? So now he's made it specific. I am asking you, Jesus, are you a seditionist? Now listen, the next verse is one of the most thoroughly, there's as much mischief done with this verse as any in the New Testament, as far as I'm concerned. And I won't get into it. You will. Praise God, you're in a place where it's going to be laid out for you, the truth of Scripture, very carefully. but there is a very, very important, dominant, blog-absorbing set of ideas, which is called replacement theology or amillennialism. Have you been into this? Amillennialism is the idea that Jesus didn't come to offer the kingdom, but to redefine the kingdom and to take it away from Israel and give it to the church, and that the kingdom is already here, and it's only a spiritual kingdom. And millennialism, meaning there won't be a millennium, that that we're all just going to go off to heaven, and there is no end time events. There is no program of end time events. This is what grips the evangelical world almost totally today in our culture. And this is their verse. I always say, you got an amillennialist friend and he accidentally drops his Bible, it's going to flop open to this verse. This is where he spends all his time. My kingdom is not of this world. Now, I'm twice troubled by that reading. Number one, it is so wrong to say for Jesus to be saying, my kingdom. What they read this to mean is that my kingdom has nothing to do with this world. My kingdom is entirely an ethereal, ephemeral abstraction in some yonder universe, Greek type of nirvana type universe. My kingdom is off yonder somewhere. It's never going to happen on this world. Did the Old Testament prophesy a kingdom that was going to happen on this earth, for heaven's sakes? You bet your bottom dollar. And so to the idea that Jesus is on trial for his life. He is standing before the prefect Pontius Pilate, who has a right to try him legally. Jesus, I think, is going to be entirely deferential to Pilate through this whole thing because he is a duly constituted Roman authority. And Pilate asks him, are you a seditionist? That's the question. Jesus has sorted it out. The question is, are you a seditionist? And Jesus seizes the opportunity to deliver himself of a one-sentence lecture on kingdom theology that totally unsays everything the Old Testament says. I don't think so. He's going to answer the question. And this is the other thing that bothers me about the way this verse is so often read. Folks, now hear me on this. It is stunning. It is staggering that this whole plot was laid in place. And yet, when Pilate and everything was about just getting Jesus to the cross as a seditionist, but Pilate discovers a reserve of character that we might not have suspected of him. He brings Jesus in alone, and he asks Jesus very simply, are you a seditionist? And Jesus gives an answer. Well, let me say it this way. After this initial interview, Pilate's going to go out and announce for the first time, this man is innocent. And then no matter what the pressure, no matter what the cost, Pilate is going to be unmoved. I don't care what you say. I'm not going to crucify the man because the man is guiltless. How did Pilate come to that conclusion? How did the man Pilate, this Roman prefect, how did he become so convinced that he refused to cave in no matter what the hideous pressure brought against him because he was so convinced that this man was innocent? How did he come to that conclusion? This argument. This is what really, it's a shame because that this is missed. Here's the point. All right, I'm going to cut to the chase. Pilate says, are you a king? Jesus says, hey, I got to straighten this out. Are you talking about am I the Messiah, or are you talking about am I a seditionist? Oh, for heaven's sakes, am I a Jew? They've accused you. What have you done? Are you guilty? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. See it on the screen. If you wonder what he means by of this world, maybe it would be helpful to read the next sentence. If my kingdom were of this world, same phrase, then would my servants fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. My kingdom doesn't come in this way. My kingdom is not from here. I think Pilate probably stood back and stroked his chin and thought for a minute. He said, you know what? This man has been going up down the countryside for the better part of 2 years. I don't live in a cave. I know this. Secondly, there are tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of people who are absolutely committed to him. They have never, ever raised their hand against Rome. I think Pilate might have thought, you know what? I know what a sedition looks like. It's happened here a lot. And it always involves this. Some pretender king finds some fastness, some hiding place out in the Jeshimon, the wilderness down by the Dead Sea, and he gets a little militia, and they come out at night, and they fall on the local villages, and they fall on the Roman troops, and they try and capture our armories and so on. I know what a seditionist looks like. It always looks the same. And that is that a pretender king gathers a militia and makes trouble for Rome. Jesus has just said, if I were by the way, This is why it's so important the night before that Peter put his sword away, because Jesus has to be able to make this argument. So he says, if my kingdom were a worldly kingdom, that's what he means by this, then would my servants fight. Now this kingdom is a physical, literal kingdom that's going to happen on this earth, but it doesn't appear through Jesus mounting a militia and attacking the Romans. And I think Pilate, listen, it's clear in the record that as a result of this encounter with Jesus, Pilate becomes totally, finally convinced that Jesus is not a seditionist. That's all you got to work with. Now, what's fascinating is in the next phrase, then he goes on to say, now again, are you with me? This is all, number one, this is all private. Pilate is alone in the praetorium with Jesus, and this is the good confession that Paul is referring to. So now Pilate rather stunningly asks, and this is why I say I have a higher regard for Pilate than some do, and Pilate asks, are you a king then? You know what? I cherish, you know what? I got to tell you. I haven't time to tell you, but I got to tell you. I mentioned to you yesterday. Folks, learn to long for the kingdom. That's where we're headed. Heaven is a stopping point. But you know what? I die. I go to heaven. I get to see the Savior. I get to be reunited with loved ones and so on. But you know what, folks? Think about this. The world still lies in the lap of the evil one. And all that is sacred is defiled, and all that is defiling is regarded as sacred. Don't you long for the day when God's going to put that right? Because what's at stake is not whether I get to go to heaven. It's the glory of the name of God, and it's defiled on this earth. And the day is coming when Messiah is going to reign on this earth in perfect justice. And I love this phrase from Habakkuk, the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as water covers the sea. That's why Jesus, when he taught you to pray, as soon as you acknowledge who God is, the next thing you say is, thy kingdom come. Oh my goodness, we ought to be hungry for the kingdom. Now my point is simply this, that Pilate says, well, are you a king? And this is stunning. This has nothing to do with the legal procedures. I think Pilate was something of a seeker. I think he'd been impressed from afar by this a Nazarene. He probably knew people who had given themselves to the Nazarene and were following him and so on. Whatever, he asks, and this has nothing to do with anything. It's just Pilate and Jesus alone. And he looks at him and he says, all right, you're not a seditionist, but are you a king? In what sense? And Jesus' reply, I love his reply. I like to say Jesus was a premillennialist. He said, you say rightly that I am a king. It was for this cause that I was born. It was for this cause that I came into the world, to testify to that truth. Now, it's an article, but I think it has demonstrative force, to testify to that truth. And he goes on to say, anyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Now, that's the first interview. Pilate throws his hands in the air, as it were, says, what is truth? He's got a hot potato. He doesn't know what he's going to do. And it just got worse, because he could perhaps earlier conceive of just sending him along the assembly line here to the crucifixion as the plan was. But now he spent time with him. I think Jesus impacted Pilate marvelously. And so now, I'm going to go quickly. Pilate goes out. He's guiltless for the first of 5 times. Folks, let me tell you this. Easter, coming pretty quick. During the Easter season, I hear it all the time, I read it all the time, you're going to hear people, right-minded people, but this is thoughtless, this is careless. You're going to hear people say that Jesus was crucified having been convicted of sedition. Folks, he was not convicted of sedition. He was exculpated. He was 5 different times the only man who had the authority to determine or to declare whether he was guilty or innocent. 5 times he says the man is absolutely innocent. I mean, there are so many evidences that Jesus died having been exonerated of sedition. That's important, folks. Sedition is a crime by the standards of the book of Romans. And Jesus, even if he wasn't true, if he went to the cross having been convicted, if that was on the record that Jesus was a convicted criminal, that's terrible. Jesus died having been exonerated of sedition. Does that make sense to you? But now we're going to tease it out. On the other hand, he died the death that Rome had designed for a seditionist. That too is very important. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Does it make sense to you? And I'll tell you why. Because, all right, let's go a little further. Because now, I'm going to pick it up. Pilate comes out. He's had this interview. Jesus has convinced him with an airtight legal argument that there is no case, whatever, to be made that he is a seditionist. Pilate's convinced. He comes out. The man is innocent. Oh, no, he's trouble ever since Galilee. Off to Herod. Nothing. He brings him back. You have the Barabbas thing. Then you have the scourging thing. And again, I think the scourging is Pilate's creative, cruel way to release Jesus. He desperately, the Bible says explicitly in Acts 3 that Pilate was determined to let Jesus go. Pilate didn't want to crucify Jesus. It's explicit in the text. But now the people say, well, if you won't, in fact, let me take you to it because it's such a pivotal passage, John 19 and verse 7. So we drop down to John 19, and I've highlighted here the times that Pilate says the man is innocent. But here in verse 7, very important, the story theologically turns right here. The Jews answered him and said, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Folks, listen. All throughout, as in all of your studies of the life of Jesus, in all of its parts, take with you consciously, make it part of your mental apparatus as you're studying the life of Jesus, this, that his claim to be God come in the flesh was unspeakably offensive. It was blasphemous. Unless, as I say, it happened to be the truth. And it was unimaginable. Listen, folks, think about this. You believe that Jesus is God, very God. Amen and amen? All right, just think. This is not a hard question. What is the primary point of evidence to which you would appeal to make that case? What's most important to make that case? Come on. What is it? It's the resurrection. These people didn't have the resurrection. All they had was a Nazarene who had lived a unusual but very normal life, who was clearly a human being. If we know anything, we know that our God's not a man, and here's this guy walking around claiming to be God come in the flesh. You've gotten used to that. It rolls off your tongue. Don't let it happen when you're thinking in the Gospels. This is unthinkable. And I think with some honesty, the accusers begin to cry out, look, if you can't crucify, if you won't crucify him as a seditionist, then we have a law. He's got to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. That's why Jesus went to the cross, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, I'd like to spend more time with it, but suffice it to say, and this is the second interview, when Pilate heard that, he went again into the praetorium. All right, so now you have the second interview, and what happens is, let me read it to you. It says, he went again into the praetorium, and he said to Jesus, I love this. He said to Jesus, look at this, where are you from? I mean, he's just overwhelmed. I think what he's saying, what's going on here? Here you are, you've healed all these people, you've never done anything wrong, and these people are crying for your crucifixion. And now they claim that you're the Son of God. That makes me a little nervous. And I'm supposed to put you to death. But Jesus gave him no answer. And so Pilate gets frustrated. He says, are you not speaking to me? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you and to release you? And Jesus says, all right, now I'm going to put a reading on this. This is very different than what you're used to. I got to be quick. He says, you could have no power at all. You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. All right, what does he mean by from above? Jesus says you'd have no power unless it was given to you from above. All right, folks. Today, most people read this to mean from my Father above, right? Is that how you hear it? In which case, what is he saying? Isn't he kind of patting Pilate in the head and saying, Pilate, don't take too much to yourself. You wouldn't have any power except my Father gave it to you. So he's really the authority. I don't think that's what he's saying. For one thing, I don't think it's the spirit that you or I ought to bring to this sort of situation. I don't think it's the spirit that Jesus brought to this situation, kind of pulling rank on Pilate. But the other thing, if that's what he means, what do you do with the next sentence? Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. How does it make sense for Jesus to say, Pilate, you wouldn't even have any authority unless my Father in heaven gave it to you. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you is Caiaphas. Therefore, Caiaphas has the greater sin. That makes no sense at all. I believe that what Jesus is saying, and the commentators are split on this, but I believe that what Jesus is saying is this. He's saying, and I like to picture, maybe my imagination's running away, but I like to picture Jesus there alone with Pilate, alone in this scene. Jesus now battered and bruised and a crown of thorns, bloody, manacled hands, and I like to picture him kind of stepping forward and taking Pilate by the shoulders. Because Pilate is kind of asking for help and saying to him, Pilate, you would have no authority at all except it was given to you from above, by which Jesus means the Roman authorities above. So the point is, Pilate, this is not your game. This is not your fight. You didn't seek me out. You are just, in the providences of God to be sure, you find yourself in this jurisdiction. So you'd have no authority. You didn't choose this fight. You have no authority except that it was given, this authority was given to you by Roman. You were assigned this jurisdiction. Therefore, now it makes all the sense in the world, the one who turned me over to you has the greater sin. The real criminal here is Caiaphas. He's the one that engineered, orchestrated this whole thing, who chased me down and got me. So, Pilate, this is not your fight. You'd have no authority whatever except that it was assigned you. The real criminal here is Caiaphas. I think that's what Jesus is saying. But now we're left with this question, folks. If that's what Jesus is saying, what is he trying to say? What does he mean? It's my persuasion that Jesus is saying to Pilate, this is not your fight. You're not primarily responsible for this. I think Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. This is really a stunning drama. Jesus has to die. Pilate has a role to play. As they say, Pilate has discovered a reservoir of character that we might not expect of him. He's not going to let it happen. And I think Jesus is saying, Pilate, this is not your fight. That's not to say that what he's going to do is not wrong. But Pilate, I think Jesus is more or less giving him permission to go ahead. Because now what happens is, Pilate comes out, tries harder to deliver Jesus, and this is where the Sanhedrin say, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Caesar. And as I say, he knows he's going to be in trouble if this is taken back to Caesar. And so Pilate, I think with some ceremony, I picture him there on that gate on the western side of the city that I showed you the picture. As a matter of fact, I think I have it. I picture him, Pilate, getting up, calling for a basin of water, with some ceremony, taking a rag, washing his hands, maybe getting up and walking down the stairway to the gate. And as he goes in the gate, handing that rag to maybe one of the soldiers and looking back over his shoulder and saying, you do with him what you will. Now that's Pilate's role. And you know, in several churches, Pilate is a saint. He's been canonized in a lot of early churches. He was remembered as a saint. Now, there's a lot that goes on in this discussion today, and I'm pretty familiar with it, but I'm just going to leave it at that. I think, and here's the point, not the point, but a point to be made. Paul says to Timothy, I adjure thee by the living God and the good confession that Jesus witnessed. And I think that good confession has to be these two private interviews. And it's staggering to me the way Jesus handles himself. He clearly has a heart for truth. He wants the truth to be clear. That's why he sorts out exactly what Pilate means. Are you asking if are you asking me if I'm king, or just guilty of what people have said of me? But beyond that, Jesus was really hungry for the will of his Father, because he is I think he is giving permission to Pilate to go ahead. But I'll tell you, the other thing to learn is this: Jesus loved Pilate. And you know what? You kids, you students, you're headed for a life of ministry, whether vocational or non-vocational. You're going to give yourself to ministry. I think very possibly in your lifetime, you're liable to be standing before hostile government authorities, giving answer for your faith. Here's the paradigm. Here's the way you handle yourself. And that's what Paul is saying. I adjure thee by the good confession. Timothy, you're going to face persecution. Handle it the way Jesus handled it. And I think the case can be made that, well, I'll tell you why. Because Pilate goes out and turns Jesus over to be crucified. But then, After he is crucified, Pilate puts up what's called a titulus. Now, I'll make much of this in the few minutes that we've got left, but suffice it to say that crucifixion had been carefully fine-tuned. It was around for a long time, but it had been fine-tuned by the Romans in order to be the design of crucifixion was not primarily to kill the seditionist. It was to put down the sedition. And crucifixion was an extended, gruesome, deliberate object lesson designed to retard whatever seditionist impulse might be in the heart of the people watching. Does that make sense to you? So it was carefully engineered. And part of that, now this wasn't an absolute given, but in many cases, it would include a title. And the title it was a board, a placard that was placed somewhere in the cross, probably above his head, and it specified the fact that this man is dying for raising his hand against Rome. So now he wrote a title, and he put on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And I love what John goes on to tell us, that when the Jewish leadership read this, they came back and they said, no, don't write Jesus, King of the Jews, write, here it is right here. He says, don't write, these are the chief priests, and they say, don't write the King of the Jews, write, he said, I am the King of the Jews. You see what that is? That's sedition. Write that he was a seditionist. He said, I'm King of the Jews. And Pilate said, what I have written, I've written. Now that's staggering. He wrote it in 3 languages. You didn't have to do that. He wanted to. Now, I can't help but connect that to what Jesus had said just a little while earlier, when he said, you say rightly that I'm a king, and anybody who loves the truth is going to embrace this. And now Pilate, I think at putting at risk both his career and his life, he emblazons above Jesus, this is the King of the Jews. I think it's a personal confession. And I think and the impact of I think one of the most delightful lessons here is the impact that Jesus had on the man Pilate. Does that make sense to you? All right, well, I got to be done. Let me go back to the PowerPoint here. So now Jesus is turned over to be crucified, and I'm going to go to the crucifixion. This is what happened in the record. Jesus, there is some preparation to be made. There are 2 others who are scheduled to be crucified. In every major Roman town, and really not the not so major towns, there was a permanent place of crucifixion, some hill. And let me tell you this about crucifixion, and I don't want to spend too much time with it, because, as I said, the real issue here is the spiritual death that Jesus is going to endure on our behalf. But he did very carefully orchestrate issues so that he would be crucified rather than being stoned. And it's worthy, I think it's legitimate to think about crucifixion, and I like to reduce it to this, that because the Romans wanted crucifixion to put down sedition, they had 4 basic demands. First of all, it had to be cruel. Now, frankly, it was cruel beyond what it is easy for us to imagine or even stomach. It was designed to be cruel. Normally, a man who was going to be crucified would be rather surgically scourged. It wouldn't be an awful scourging. It would be because the second demand that the Romans made, it had to be lingering. They didn't want him to die quickly on the cross. They wanted him to hang on that cross at least a day and maybe into a second day. But they would give him, so they didn't want to debilitate him with a scourging, but they wanted to open up lateral wounds all the way up and down his backside, because on the cross, within a few minutes, your rib cage sets in on your breathing apparatus, and you can't breathe without hoisting yourself up. And most people died on the cross of asphyxiation. You can't sleep, you can't go into a coma, because you have to physically, and there were always apparati. It might be the nails through the feet, through the ankles, it might be some sort of saddle, but there was a means by which he could raise himself up. And as he did, those splinters in that rough timber behind him would would thrust themselves into those newly opened wounds. And of course, the victim is just going to cry out in anguish. That's what it's all about. They want a display of unspeakable cruelty so that you know this is what you're bound for if you raise your hand against Rome. You know, it occurs to me, and this is kind of a silly thought, but it's really amazing that we have made the cross. We've sanitized it. Oh, we've sanitized it. But you know, I always think if you met a young lady and you're just talking with her, you never met her before, but as you're talking to her, you notice she's got a little chain or a pendant around her a neck with some charms, and as you look at it, you happen to notice that one of them is a guillotine. You know, it's a finely crafted little guillotine. Wouldn't you think, well, that's macabre? You know, why would she? Somebody's going to show up with these one at a time and ruin my illustration. But I think we'd all think, well, you know, here's the interesting thing. The guillotine, Dr. Guillotine, that was designed to be what? Quick and merciful. The cross was designed to be lingering and cruel. It's just staggering that we have, man, we only did it in the 4th century. In the first 3 centuries, the cross was not a symbol of Christianity, but it became that with Constantine and so on. But it's a little bit dangerous to allow that sanitized idea of the cross to grip our minds, because this is as awful. Now, so I said it's cruel, it's lingering. Thirdly, it's public. And so it's always on a low hill, just a low hill outside of a main gate. And the reason is because the gate of the city is a bottleneck. You can't go around. So you're going to have to you may press yourself way over against the wall. You may take the folds of your garment and fold it around your kids' heads, you know, and try and muffle the sound and so on and quickly get into the gate. But you're going to have to pass that way, and the hill is just high enough that no matter how thick the crowd, over their heads, you can see this poor wretch hanging here, suffering beyond what you can imagine. So now there's one other element, and I'm going to come back to it one more time. But that's what crucifixion was, and so preparation is made, and Jesus is the vertical posts were permanent in the ground, but the victim would carry the cross piece and so on. Jesus carries it out, and you know those stories. Simon is asked to help him and so on, and he stumbles. But in point of fact, by 9 o'clock, Jesus is on the cross. And now, during the first 3 hours, and understand that he's going to be on the cross from 9 in the morning, what Mark calls the 3rd hour, but he's using Jewish reckoning where it begins at sunup. So the 3rd hour is about our 9 o'clock. And he's going to be taken off the cross about 6 o'clock in the evening. 3 o'clock. So he's on the cross from, 9 o'clock till 3 o'clock. All right, now, the 9th hour by Jewish reckoning. During the first 3 hours, the sun is light. And then at noon, God draws a curtain of grayness across this scene. It's not an eclipse. It's not pitch dark like you had in the Exodus. God wants this to be seen. But it's just, there are so many ways in which God surrounds this with evidence of that this is God's work. There's so many supernatural elements. And one of them is this curtain of grayness that must have been, I think the sun is shining full, but somehow, I say full, you can see the sun, but its light goes dim and there's a grayness. And all of that just to make the point that what's going on here is the most awful miscarriage of justice, the most offensive event that could possibly happen in the moral universe. Now, interestingly, this mysterious darkness is remembered from other parts of the world. So it was the whole world. I think the sun somehow grows dim. And during the first 3 hours, Jesus speaks 3 times. I'm going to go through them real quickly. I got to hurry. First of all, you remember this? Okay, let me say this too. All of these are scattered through the 4 Gospels. So you've got to harmonize them. And there are a couple of places where we can't be exactly sure which order and so on. But basically, it's clear that before the sun grows dim, Jesus speaks, first of all, to say, Father, forgive them. And, again, there's a lot I'd like to say about it, but he says they know not what they do. And I think the primary reference is it's just they can't embrace, the Jews can't, this idea of God becoming man. And then he says to this thief next to him, today, now this is amazing because you remember this story, but very quickly, the thief, the dying thief, prays an entirely Old Testament prayer. He says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The Old Testament saint was confident of resurrection onto a glorious messianic kingdom. The meanwhile, he knew nothing about the grave. It was dark. It was mysterious. Nobody had ever gone there. It was fearful and so on. So now he prays an Old Testament prayer, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus, I think this is the first man to die with the biblical confidence that he was going immediately to a place of paradise. And Jesus says, no, I can do better than that. Today, you'll be with me in paradise. It's a stunning promise. And then, of course, he looks down, and I think this is, there's so much to be said here, but here is Jesus, forgive me, here's Jesus hanging on the cross. Now, let me tell you this, and some of this is conjecture, maybe all of it. But knowing what I know, I mean, what we can know about crucifixion and so on, I think this may be what's involved. One of the elements of the suffering on the cross that was really hideous is that the victim was always high enough to be seen, but low enough that the dogs could nibble. And the dogs would begin to nibble at the feet, and the birds would begin to peck out the eyes while he was still alive. Now, this was Roman protocol, but it was quite common for the Roman soldiers to allow somebody, and it would normally be a family member, to stand at the foot of the cross just with a swish, and just to chase away the dogs and chase away the birds to save the poor victim that element of ignominy. I think very possibly Jesus looks down, and there stands Mary. And I wonder if she's not doing that duty. But what is staggering is that his own brothers are not there. And his heart is heavy for his brothers. By the way, we know the rest of the story. We know that they're going to come to faith. But there's no evidence that Jesus knew that as he hung there. If the Spirit of God had directed him, but there's no evidence. And so Jesus' heart is heavy not only with the fact that he's about to endure separation from the Father on your behalf and mine, but his own brothers. Do you have loved ones who are lost? Does that break your heart? Does it mean anything to know that Jesus understands that perfectly? But Jesus looks down, sees his mother, his brothers, sees in the crowd John, and he calls John out. And he says, John, behold your mother. And he says, woman, not mother, because he's not going to be there anymore. Woman, behold your son. And to his, I got no time for this, but it's so important to me. Jesus was the eldest son. Now, he was the adopted son of Joseph, physical son of Mary, but he was the eldest son. Joseph died sometime between when Jesus was at the temple at the age of 12 and when he went to be baptized by John. When Joseph died, Jesus would have stepped into the role of elder brother to care for his mother, to educate his siblings, and so on. Jesus knows what it is to raise a family. He knows what it is to have his heart broken by the family he raised. And to his dying breath, he is sensitive to his responsibility, his love for his mother. And he is caring for his mother at that moment. Well, sometime after that, the sky grows dark, and for 3 hours, Jesus is silent. And at the end of those 3 hours, Jesus speaks again. And by now, he has hung in unspeakable physical suffering and debilitation for 6 hours. It says something again about his virility as a lifetime stonemason, that he could endure this. But he hung there and he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the first verse of Psalm 22. The point to be made is, I think this is the definition. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, that in the Bible, death is separation from the Father. And this son who had known the blessed, infinitely close relationship with his Father from eternity, for these hours is going to be judicially disfellowshipped. And this is the terror of the cross. This is what filled Jesus' heart with terror. And there is a bottomless measure, an infinite measure of suffering that Jesus is going to endure. And I believe every bit of it is just as painful for the Father as Jesus is disfellowshipped by the Father. And he endures that for 3 hours. I think that's what's going on. And he defines it now, and he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But then let me take you to John 19, because after he has said, and again, you got to understand that no one gospelist gives us all of these, so we got to harmonize them and put them together. But quite clearly, it was only after the 3 hours, Matthew is explicit, of darkness that Jesus cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But then, John tells us that after this, now this is, okay, in the course of the crucifixion, he says, Jesus, knowing that all things were now completed, accomplished. Folks, I was just talking to a couple of students earlier. Know this, the atoning work was done on the cross. He is going to die. Physical death is a part of the curse. He is going to experience physical death. He is not going to go to a place of suffering and damnation for 3 days. There may be some activity of his soul spirit. I think there is, but I don't want to talk about it. I mean, we don't have time. But the fact is that the atoning work was done on the cross. And Jesus had hung there in this bottomless spiritual suffering for 3 hours. In so doing, that spiritual death was enough in God's economy to cover God's holiness. And so now, he knowing that all things were accomplished, in order that Scripture might be fulfilled. I think that's the point. That all that the Scripture demanded concerning the death of an innocent victim had been accomplished. And so, but what he says is, I thirst. Now, these 7 sayings always seem to me like a little bit of a, which of these is not like the other exercise? You know what I'm saying? Because you got these majestic, and then you've got I thirst. Well, I think there are 6 sayings. But here's what happens. Jesus is hung there now for 6 hours. We know that crucifixion saps the body of every drop of moisture. Not only the moisture in a body, but the moisture in the red blood cells. And it just absolutely, and what happens is, everything starts to swell. And your throat swells and your tongue swells. Many victims died of asphyxiation when they lost the capacity to draw in air because everything got so swollen. And Jesus has been hanging here for these 3 hours, and his body is just suffering beyond what we can imagine, and his throat box is so swollen, so parched, so dry, he can't speak. But he has something to say that he desperately longs to say. He has something to say that the whole moral universe is longing to hear him say. He has something to say that he has paid an unspeakably dear price to earn the right to say, but his body is so racked and swollen that he can't say it. And so I think probably in a voice that only could be heard at the foot of the cross, Jesus forces out, I thirst. And there's a soldier down there, he hears that, and he takes a sponge and soaks it with cheap wine and holds it up, and I picture Jesus taking a minute, trying to get a little life back into his throat and take some of the swelling down so he can speak because he has something to say. See, I can never get past this. He has something to say that he longs to say and that we long to hear him say. And so he spends that time getting a little bit of life back in his throat and he cries out, "It is finished. It's done. The books are balanced." Just think about that. The price has been paid. Can you imagine what would be more offensive to a loving God than for you or me or anybody to think there's something we got to add to that? It's finished. It's done. And after that, Jesus says, Father, before it was my God, but now all things are accomplished. It's finished. Into thy hands I commend my spirit. Now, Jesus' body is going to be laid in a tomb. That tomb is going to be, somebody brought this up the other day, and it's worth talking about real quickly. I got to be done. But because the Jewish authorities were afraid, they knew that Jesus had said he'd rise on the 3rd day. His own disciples didn't hear it, but they heard it. And so they thought that the disciples might try and steal it. And so it says that they asked for Pilate to put a seal. Now, this is not the sealing on the end of the 3rd day. This is just a piece of clay you would put on the seam between the rock and the cave, and you'd put a signet ring in it. And the idea was they wanted to secure it so that nobody could get into it except for somebody who had Roman authority. But the point is that his body is laid in a tomb late on Friday. It's a borrowed tomb. On Sunday morning, some women are going out to finish the preparation of the body for burial, and they discover the tomb is empty. And angels are there to say, why do you look for the living among the dead? He has risen as he told you and gone into Galilee. And so, on that first day, now listen, on Sunday, you have a series of about 5 resurrection appearances. And then Jesus lives out his life for 40 days on earth, showing himself alive by many infallible proofs. Folks, 2 points. Number 1, how does God, and we haven't spent as much time with this as we should, but I'll just tell you real quickly. How consistently throughout Scripture does God vindicate a man's claim to be a divine messenger? Here comes somebody, says, I got a message from God. How does God prove that true? Miracle. Real miracles. That's how God, what's the greatest miracle in all time? The resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Why was he crucified? If you won't crucify him as a seditionist, then you ought to crucify him because we have a law. He claims to be the Son of God. Romans 1, verse 4. Paul says that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. And the word that Paul uses there for declared is the word horizo. And it's our word horizon. And I like to think that what he's saying is it was spread across the sky from earth to sky, from east to west in such a way that nobody could miss it. He was horizon. He was declared. Nobody can deny that he is what he claims to be because of the resurrection from the dead. He was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. Let me make one other point to you here. I just got a couple of minutes. It's fascinating to me that in the book of John, 3 times Jesus himself speaks of being lifted up. Can you remember these? John 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And then in John chapter 8, when the Pharisees are saying, oh, you're just speaking for yourself, you're not speaking for God, he says this, when I am lifted up, then you'll know I'm speaking for the Father. And then in John 12, that passage we looked at earlier, he said, if I am lifted up, will draw them into myself. And I've heard that phrase lifted up treated as if it meant to exalt Jesus. That's not what it means. Because John goes on in John 12 and verse 30, Jesus says, if I be lifted up, I'll draw myself into myself. And John says, this spake he concerning the type of death he would die. And then when Jesus is hauled before Pilate by the Sanhedrinists, and they say, just crucify him, and Pilate says, I'm not going to do it, and they say, you know that we can't put him to death. John says this was done in fulfillment of what Jesus had said concerning the type of death he would die. The Bible is explicit, type of death. How we might have expected Jesus to die by stoning. That was the standard Jewish way. But in point of fact, I believe that Jesus contrived to die by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. So, why? Why was it so important? The Bible's not explicit. I have an answer. See if you like it. I told you, and the question I'm asking you, why was it so important that Jesus die by crucifixion? Let me go back to the way the Romans crafted crucifixion. It had to be cruel, had to be lingering, had to be public, but above all things, it had to be absolutely certifiable. That is, the Romans would not tolerate the possibility that a man would be crucified and somehow survive the experience and the word could get out, the sedition could go on. So there had to be physical evidence on the cross. And if a man were brought down inadvertently and there was the last sign of life on the earth and he died, every Roman officer, every Roman soldier assigned to that was immediately put in a cross. That's how serious Rome was, that if you're put on a Roman cross, you're not coming down till you're a dead person, and we got physical evidence of it. Now, you didn't have to be there that afternoon to see the blood in the water to know that as soon as you heard that this Nazarene was crucified by the Romans, you know that he didn't come down until he was dead. Stoning could be botched. Crucifixion could not be botched. And the miracle of the resurrection is absolutely undeniable only to the degree that we know for certain that Jesus died. And so it was expedient that he be lifted up and die at the hands of the Romans so nobody could deny that he was physically dead. And now 3 days later, the tomb is empty and he shows himself alive by many infallible proofs for 40 days. That's what gives the gospel credibility. Does that make sense to you? All right, thank you. You got to admit, that was, my timing's good, if nothing else. You got to admit.